I've bought 89 pieces of land in North Carolina just in the past couple of years. I learned a lot, and I want to share a couple thoughts about, what I learned in that process. The first and most disappointing thing that I think that I had to grapple with was that you just have title issues all the time when you buy land. In North Carolina in particular, when you put a property through title, when you're going to buy it, sometimes the property's been in the same family for many years, and what happens with land that's been in one family for a long time is that people die. And when people die without an estate or a will, it complicates things because the family has an idea of how the inheritance works on that land, but the problem is that the paperwork wasn't done right. And so when you go through title, it just kicks back, and you typically can't close these properties without doing a lot of paperwork. Talk to an estate attorney before you give up, because a lot of times there are lawyers that can clean this stuff up for you. Soil quality is a major variable too, because a lot of these pieces of land you have to install septic in order to build a home, and the ability for the soil to drain is really the make or break for septic systems. So a lot of properties, even if the soil is bad for septic, that's one thing, but then a lot of properties have floodplain and wetlands, kind of like this actually. Recognize those? Wetlands are federally regulated, so if you got wetlands on your property, you just got to be careful, make sure that you understand what requirements come with that, if there's any extra paperwork or things that you can and can't do on your property. A couple good resources are the State Department of Environmental Quality, and then also the Army Corps of Engineers. There's a online mapping system for wetlands that landowners should be aware of, especially in eastern North Carolina by the coastal plains. It's the Fish and Game wetlands mapper, and it's free. You can just see a pretty good map across the entire country where the wetlands are, what type of wetlands there are. Floodplains are the other thing you have to be aware of too, because floodplains are not all created equal. There's different levels of floodplain that come with different regulations and different impact if you're trying to build in that area. Some parts of the floodplain, like the flood hazard, you actually can't build at all. The 500-year floodplain, typically you actually don't have any regulations that come with that, because it's almost like Noah's Ark. It's like a rare occurrence. But the 100-year floodplain is where a lot of the building regulations come into play, because the 100-year floodplain, you typically have to plan for an elevated building foundation, which is kind of significant because anything that requires you to do more engineering just adds to the cost of building a home in a floodplain. But the good news is that just because you're in the 100-year floodplain doesn't really mean that it's the end of the world, because the area towards the edge of the floodplain, towards the edge of the 100-year flood, is typically higher ground, so you don't have to raise your building foundation as much. Also, especially in rural areas, you have to be careful before you buy land, because you really have to walk the whole property. Some people will say you need to get a survey for every piece of land that you buy, but I actually don't adhere to that, because surveys are pretty expensive these days. I mean, even for a small 1 or 2 acre lot, surveys are going for $1,500, $2,000. Gone are the days when you would just check the box and it was just part of your settlement at closing, and it was $300-400, like you didn't have to think about it. Surveys have certainly gotten more expensive since the start of COVID, and it's like a really in-demand service. The reason that I don't always do surveys is because a lot of properties already have survey maps established, and you can go on the county records and very easily identify those maps. The benefit of doing that is that the maps will point to a detailed 2-dimensional map of the property that shows where all the corners are, and then all the boundary lines are too. Rather than expending the full cost of getting a survey done, what I'd recommend you consider, if you're trying to save cost, is actually to hire someone to identify where the irons are in the field, because typically a surveyor can get they can have some equipment, a metal detector, and they can actually flag the corner of all the corners of the property with a marker so that when you walk the property, as you always should, you can see exactly where the property boundaries are, and then everything inside it is the land that you're buying. Sometimes neighbors will dump trash on the neighboring property. They know where the property lines are, and then they go just beyond them, and then sometimes they dump trash there. So you want to really be careful before you buy a property that you can see where the adjacent areas are between your land and then the land next to you, because over the years sometimes people have a habit of discarding things in the woods that they would have to pay or inconvenience themselves to discard through the appropriate means. After we buy property, we've learned our lesson, because sometimes when we buy property, we find out later that there's junk in the woods. And if it's just, one dumpster load of trash, we're getting off easy, because we've had cases where it's like $1,500, $2,000, several trips to the dumpster. You have to hire junk removal specialists that are insured, that have equipment. You got to get a couple guys out there and a crew, and it's just like not cheap anymore either, just like surveys. And you may think that, okay, but I know someone that might be able to help me do it for more cheap, and you may have some equipment of your own, and I think that it's worth considering if that's the case. But some of the stuff is really heavy duty. We're talking about, we've had stuff where big waterlogged mattresses, like king size mattresses, waterlogged and molded in the woods, that are probably like a couple 100 pounds. We've had, big pieces of metal, just scrap metal, large, sharp, rusted piece of metal, and it's all aged and like it's caked down underneath, trees and pine cones, leaves, and all the elements have just been layering in this trash. It's almost like a landfill. It's like an unofficial landfill in some cases. It's really significant. So the cost of that is one thing, but also there's other risks that come with that, because people dump, they dump fuel, they'll dump fuel canisters out there, so you really want to be sure that you're not buying a liability, you're buying an asset. That's the idea anyway. So those are the three things I see quite often in North Carolina. One is title issues. The second thing is the soil and environmental. You should always get a soil evaluation done on any piece of land that you're buying. Then lastly, you want to walk the property and be sure you know where the boundaries are, what it is that you're buying, and making sure your neighbors didn't dump anything naughty back there in the woods where they shouldn't have.